In the last example in 4.4 day 1 we were talking about amplitude. Now we will focus on period for this example, and again we're not really going to look at frequency in this section. That'll be more for next unit. Period, as we briefly talked about, is the length of one full cycle of the graph or the wave. Now the basic period's 2 pi if it is untouched. So if there aren't any transformations or anything like that going on, then the period is 2 pi. And we saw that from our graphs earlier. For instance, this graph where it was 2 pi to get from here all the way to the end where it starts repeating itself. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet are the two forms of sinusoids, or sine and cosine graphs. And these include all the different possible transformations that'll be happening when we're graphing a sine or a cosine. One thing to know is that today all we're going to be looking at is A and B. We already talked about A, that was for amplitude. B is going to have to do with the period. That's going to change what the width of a wave is horizontally. And so what that's going to do is it's going to have an effect on horizontal stretch and shrink. Now the period is going to be calculated by this little formula right here, 2 pi divided by the absolute value of B. I usually just call it 2 pi divided by B, and I just ignore the negative. So you can do that if you would like. But we're going to take each one of these, take a look at them, and see what happens when we do that. So what transformation does that represent? So we've got here cosine of negative 4x. Now the absolute value of B is 4. So if I want to know the period in this graph, it's just going to be 2 pi divided by 4, which is pi over 2. Now notice that pi over 2 being the period, that is a smaller distance than 2 pi. So if we're looking at this, that's calling it, we're going to say it is a horizontal shrink because it's smaller than the 2 pi. Now how much did it shrink by? How many times smaller is it? Well, we can get a clue from the fact that this is 4. So remembering back to when we were talking about horizontal stretch and shrink for the first time, that it's always going to be written, if we're talking horizontal shrink or stretch, it's going to be written in terms of division. So 4x is the same thing as x divided by 1/4. We have to have it set up in that format in order to really comment on the horizontal shrink or stretch. And so in this case, that'll mean that it's horizontal shrink by a factor of 1/4. The factor is always the number that's being divided, that is dividing here. So we've got that for cosine of negative 4x. Now the other transformation that we would have here, since it is a negative, is a reflection, but this time the reflection is going to be over the y-axis, because that negative is right on the x part, so we're going to have a reflection over the y-axis if the negative is in there. Those are the two transformations that are dealing with this here. So it was a change of period and we reflected it, giving us these two transformations. Now let's talk about this next one, sine of x over 2. Well, another way to rewrite this would be sine of 1/2 x. And the only reason I say that is because then this is b and we can more easily calculate the period. So the period is going to be 2 pi divided by 1/2. And when you divide by 1/2, remember that is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So we do that, 2 pi divided by 1/2, or 2 pi times 2 is 4 pi. And so if the period is 4 pi, what that means is that we have this, in this case instead, the period's getting longer, so this is a horizontal stretch instead. Now it's twice as big, so we say it's a horizontal stretch by a factor of 2. And again, we can think about horizontal stretch and shrink based on the x divided by some number, so that factor is just straight out of this denominator that we have right there. So when we're talking about horizontal stretch and shrink, it's because of the period. Period starts at 2 pi. We change that based on the coefficient there, and so amplitude and period will be those two things that we use to help us graph different sines and cosines by hand.